The Cringey music teacher explains note values. All notes and rests take up a certain amount of time in music. To fully understand the length of time each note gets, we're going to start with a 4-beat measure of music. Remember, a measure in music is the space between two bar lines. Our measure is going to contain 4 beats. The space for each beat will be shown with a heart. Let's start with the whole note. It gets 4 beats of sound. Since it gets 4 beats of sound, it takes up the whole measure. This is why it's called a whole note. Next, let's see the half note. It gets 2 beats of sound. Wait, what about a note that gets 3 beats? We will get to that later, I promise. Back to the half note. Since it gets 2 beats of sound, it takes up half of the measure. That's why it's called a half note.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You can put 2 half notes into a measure. Now, let's look at the quarter note. It gets 1 beat of sound. Since the quarter note gets 1 beat, you can have 4 quarter notes in one measure. Now, time for some math.
Wait, what?
The quarter note gets 1 of the 4 beats in the measure. Let's look at that as a pie chart. As a fraction, the quarter note's value would look like this. It gets 1 beat out of the 4 beats, or 1/4. Another way to say 1/4 is calling it a quarter. That's why it's called a quarter note. Now, things are going to break down farther. Buckle up. This is an eighth note. It gets half of a beat of sound. It takes 2 eighth notes to make 1 beat. So it takes 8 eighth notes to fill a measure. So 1 eighth note is 1/8 of a measure. That's why it's called an eighth note. Oftentimes, eighth notes are paired together to add to 1 beat. When 2 eighth notes are next to one another, they link together with their flags. Now let's see another note. This is a 16th note. It looks like an eighth note, but with an extra flag. It gets 1/4 of a beat of sound. It takes 16 16th notes to fill a 4-beat measure. That's why it's called a 16th note. Often in music, 16th notes are grouped into 4 to add up to 1 beat. Their flags all connect to make one symbol. Remember when I said I'd tell you about a note that gets 3 beats of sound? Now I'm ready to explain. So this is the dotted half note. It gets 3 beats of sound. Now, why it gets 3 beats of sound is different than why other notes get their values. The dot added to this half note is what gives it that extra beat. A dot added to a note adds half the value of the note onto it. I know, more math. So a half note alone gets 2 beats of sound. Adding a dot to it adds on half its value. Half of 2 is 1, so the dot adds 1 beat to the note. 2 plus 1 is 3, so it gets 3 beats. But the dot isn't just used to create a 3-beat note. It can be added to a whole note. In this case, let's figure out how many beats the dotted whole note would get. A whole note gets 4 beats of sound. The dot adds half of that onto it. Half of 4 is 2, so 4 plus 2 is 6. The dotted whole note gets 6 beats of sound. The dot can also be added to a quarter note. A quarter note gets 1 beat, Half of 1 is a half. So a dotted quarter note gets 1.5 beats of sound. This was a lot of information and a lot of math, but I hoped it helped it all make a little more sense.